That's true. Very cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
We learn new things every day, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's cool.
I mean, that's the type of thing that probably happened on April Fool's Day, and we're probably getting trolled, but that does sound Tartakova.
I'm going to stick to that story because I like it. And you see that in sports all the time, right? You know, animals being involved in betting on the World Cup in football or any other sport, right?
There was the octopus, which predicted all the results at the football.
Yeah.
It was uncannily good, wasn't it?
Yeah. It did quite good.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Black has just moved his bishop, trying to eliminate the white knight. We did mention that the black bishops don't really have a purpose. Black is trying to exchange that off, but he doesn't have time yet. Anish Giri is in trouble, I think. White there, bringing the rook across, kicking away the black queen, trying to hit the black queen at least. We saw Giri's face. He's not happy. He knows that this orangutan, it has tricked him. It has confused him. And now, look at Stockfish, look at the computer suggestions for Black's best move. There's only one good move in this position for Black, and even Black's best move gives White a +1 advantage. White is about to win a pawn. If we bring up the analysis board, we can see that in the current position, after Black moved his bishop to try and eliminate this knight, Magnus ignored it. Magnus just shifted his rook across, and now Black's queen is in big trouble. She doesn't want to trade herself off for White's queen, because suddenly, if we see a queen exchange, look at how ugly these black pawns are now. They're shattered, they're divided, they're isolated, they're easy pickings for White's pieces. So if you can't trade queens, what else can you do? You have to retreat. Surely this is what Anish Giri is thinking about, but once you retreat, which Anish Giri does, you lose protection of this pawn. Magnus doesn't hesitate. He takes that pawn off the board. That's why White has a +1 advantage. He's simply a pawn up, and White threatening a second pawn with his rook and with his queen. Magnus in control here.
Yeah, okay, and Anish has been forced onto the defensive there. He is moving his rook one square up just to defend the pawn, and you know, the move that Anish would really have loved to play was actually to move the rook to attack the queen, but that was no good because Magnus could simply capture the pawn. And Anish in real trouble now. I mean, is there any way that he can steady the ship and just say, okay, yes, I'm fine, I'm a pawn down, but I have bishop pair. I can create some mess on the board.
Yeah, that bishop pair that you mentioned, he's trying to get rid of one of his bishops. He's trying to trade it off for one of White's knights. Well, White's remaining knights. So I don't think the bishop pair are give too much compensation right now. I mean, Giri's not lost, but long term, being that one pawn down and having no real counterplay, it doesn't bode well for Giri fans.
Yeah. And now we have a decision. Yeah, Magnus has retreated his knight, and now would you capture that knight? Because that knight is headed. Yep. Okay. Well, Anish says absolutely, and now there is something to be hopeful about, and that is the presence of opposite color bishops. If on one wonderful day,
if the queens disappear, if all the rooks
and
disappear,
the rooks disappear, perhaps this dark square bishop can start to do something. And on that note, Anish has simply pushed his pawn forward, and he is trying to just explode open the position because he needs to give his dark square bishop a target.
Yeah, White's pawn structure was just too strong. Everything protecting each other. Anish Giri, he knows that if he didn't seize that moment, sometimes in chess you have to do that. It might not be a good move, but you have to chip away at your opponent's strong points. And Anish Giri, he's trying his best now. But one move, actually, I see two moves that look quite promising for White, for Magnus Carlsen. Both of those two moves involve pinning the pawn that has just advanced.
Would you do it with the rook on the third row?
I'm not sure which one. If we bring up the analysis board, we can see what Magnus Carlsen is thinking about. Anish Giri pushing this pawn forward, trying to undermine White's strongest pawn. White's pawn, we should mention, cannot take because it would be a pin. This rook would be undefended. White would lose a piece here, and as you've predicted, Ivanka, he slides across his rook instead. So this rook, which was undefended, now creates a pin of its own. These rooks on these open lines, they're so good at tying down the opponent's forces, and we do see a trade of queens right now, but Magnus, he has plenty of choice here. He could trade a set of pawns, but there's no rush. Maybe you just bring your remaining rook into the game, that rook doing nothing, and you're eyeing up weak pawns. Yes, there are opposite color bishops, but as long as rooks remain on the board, Black is still far, far away from holding the draw here. And you could definitely imagine a scenario where White starts pushing this pawn. Maybe if you can eliminate this guy, note how White's corner pawn, once it gets to the end of the board, it is going to promote on a square that's guarded by White's bishop. So that's the long-term plan to try and win this game for White.
And what I find really instructive about this game is that Magnus hasn't rushed to clarify anything to do with the structure in the center. He hasn't traded pawns, he hasn't advanced anything. Instead, he has improved his rook and maximized that piece before he will even think about doing something in the center. You know, that situation can clarify itself later on. Love it. This is fantastic in-game strategy.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Ivanka, if you do rush to push your pawns, this is very tempting, this type of move. But firstly, you block in your own bishop. This pawn blocks in White's bishop. But secondly, you can imagine Black just blockading this pawn quite easily on dart squares. That's why opposite color bishops have such a drawish tendency, because you can blockade on one color complex. And okay, that's why Magnus Carlsen didn't hurry to push his pawns, and now instead bringing his rook across, Anish Giri forced to just defend this guy, this pawn here. It's not looking good for Giri. No matter what White does, I mean, he has maybe 2 or 3 moves here. He can just sit, he can just wait, and Black is tied up. Black's rook defending this pawn, Black's rook defending this pawn. All of Black's pieces are passive, and this bishop, no targets, simply.
Yeah. And, well, it does look like it's bad news for Anish on the board. But, you know, well, I have to kind of refer you to Michel's tweet. He says that he would, if he owned a cryptocurrency, he would call it Anish coin. The more he tweets, the more value. So, yeah, we are asking if you created your own cryptocurrency, what would you call it and why? And Mariano Juncal says, and this one's a really sentimental one, he says that he would call it Frida in honor of his late grandmother.
Oh, that's nice.
Taught him how to play poker, amongst many other things, and of course Frida Kahlo. But yep, some moves have been played, and Magnus doing what Magnus loves to do, piling on the pressure. He's advanced the pawn 2 squares, and he's getting ready to potentially destabilize those 2 black pawns on the left side. You know, every single move poses problems for Anish.
Yeah, and we did highlight that one pawn that has advanced there for White. That is the potential game winner, that pawn. It does promote on the same color as White's bishop. In combination, those 2 pieces have actually won me probably countless games, but probably hundreds of games. Once you have your light square bishop along the long diagonal, that it does support the push of your corner pawn. And the more pieces get traded, if you can eliminate the defenders of that pawn advance, I think Magnus, he's already got his eye on pushing that pawn as far as it can go. Right now, Giri, the one thing I'm surprised by, actually, is that he hasn't slowed down too much. I did mention it's good in his kind of career development that he has been playing confidently, has been playing very quickly, Anish Giri, but there are certain moments in games where you do need to slow down, you do need to invest 3 or 4 minutes, and he hasn't done that so far. It might be too late, however, for Anish Giri to save this game. It's just that difficult right now.
Wow.
He's spending time finally, but that's because it's hard to even find one productive move.
How do you feel about Magnus's play in this game after that surprise opening?
Smooth.
Yeah.
Smooth. He's never looked back. He had one strategy in mind. That was to gain these central pawns. He undermined Black's central pawns. He got rid of those. He kept his center intact. It's still there for now. White's very strong center, and yeah, Magnus, he's been very consistent with his strategy. Meanwhile, and he's just retreating a bishop there, trying to pin White's central pawn.
Yeah. And how do you think Anish will be feeling? Because, you know, when your opponent plays something so unconventional, and especially with something with the name of orangutan that is traditionally considered, well, not great.
Optimal.
Yeah. How do you think will it be playing on his mind that, hey?
Yeah, I mean, nobody likes to lose a game, let alone when your opponent plays maybe not even in the best way. I mean, for example, there have been cases in the past of an opening like the Bong Cloud, which is maybe the most extreme example of a bad opening. And if you lose to an opening like that one, it can wreck your confidence for the rest of the tournament. And Anish Giri, if he loses to the orangutan opening, and actually he got bad position straight out the opening, it's going to be hard to recover from that.
Exactly. You know, like one famous example we have in English history is when Tony Miles was playing black against Anatoly Karpov, who was the world champion at the time, and he opened with an opening called St. George's Defence, and now that is basically moving the Queen's rook pawn one square forward, and it is a terrible, terrible reputation. And, well, in fact, Tony Miles won. And after that, the game went into the history books.
Yeah, he shocked Karpov, he shocked the world champion with... Yeah, I mean, it's purely surprise value. It's purely psychological. Moving the corner pawn, or even the orangutan opening, it doesn't control the center. It doesn't help develop any pieces. It doesn't put your opponent under any pressure. But psychologically, that's where the pressure lies. You just say to your opponent, I'm not necessarily trolling you, but I'm just going to provoke you. And yeah, Anish Giri, he didn't react to that provocation in the best way. Right now, Magnus, thinking for a while, he spent 2 minutes on this last move. I don't see any reason why not to just maybe shift up that white rook, which does lie on the same diagonal as black's bishop. Just move that piece, maybe just shift it up one square. You don't want your pieces to be targets for the opponent's bishop, but okay, Magnus retreating his bishop. I'm surprised by that one. That wasn't on my radar, at least. It looked like that bishop was on a fantastic diagonal, but now Magnus retreating that. I think he wants to plant his bishop on another square to protect white's corner pawn, but it feels like that's a bit of a luxury. What do you think, Jovanka? Is that too slow, or is that a bit of finesse by Magnus Carlsen?
I think it's a bit of finesse. I mean, I agree with you that bishop doesn't look like it's doing too much, but it is ready to support a pawn if that white pawn gets 2 squares, which is it's going to be a very dangerous pawn, to say the least. But I didn't really see an alternative to it. You're either going to run with your king or you're going to do something with your rook. So why not create the psychological threat of... Because the thing is, in this position, Anish is actually going to be thinking, what is he doing with that? Aha, he wants to support a pawn. And if that white pawn gets to that particular square 2 squares forward, then, oh my God, I'm going to be in trouble. And that psychological chain of thought can lead to a lot of problems. And Anish might be desperately trying to find a remedy, and that remedy might be worse than worse than doing nothing.
Yeah, and it's hard to find a remedy. It's also hard to do nothing in this position for Anish Giri. You can't give your opponent all the time in the world to just slowly improve the pieces. Like you said, maybe white can even start bringing the king towards the center, getting ready for any action later on in the game. But meanwhile, what does black do? I don't see a move necessarily right now.
Put a king on a dark square, push a pawn.
Push a pawn.
Push a pawn on the right, and...
maybe if we bring up the analysis board, maybe the move I would be tempted to play here is actually to move this piece. Because right now, you want to play pawn takes pawn in the center of the board, but the rook behind it would hang. The rook is loose and undefended. So if you can move this piece, for example, I'm not sure the best square, but for example, if you shift it across, line up your rooks, now everything is ganged up against this square. White has to release this tension. White has to play pawn takes pawn now. And maybe black's best would be to capture this white rook. And after a few trades, we see, yes, white is still a pawn up, but at least now you have clarified some tension for black. You're one step closer to your goal as black. Okay, he finds this move, and if we reach this position that I'm showing on the analysis board, then suddenly Magnus's chances of winning, I think, have diminished. Suddenly black can even plant his bishop on this square to protect this weak pawn. And how are you going to make progress with white? Yes, you don't have any weaknesses. Yes, you can maybe try and coordinate, activate the white rook, the white bishop, but you don't have any passed pawns at least. And without passed pawns in an endgame, it's always incredibly difficult to win. So I think Anish, with this last move, finding this move, this one, lining up his rooks together, I think he's found a great defensive try. Probably the best best possible move in that difficult position.
What a game.
Yeah, what a game. Magnus coming up with some crazy stuff in the opening, putting the pressure on, but now Anish digging deep, trying to defend.
Yeah. I really like that move that you suggested there, David, because that was the only move, I think, to stay in the game. Everything else was looking really, really bad for black. And the situation now is white is absolutely forced to capture that pawn. There's too much tension in the center,
So why is Magnus now thinking for so long if that's just something he has to do?
Because he didn't see it.
I think he's working out the consequences as well. he definitely had better options on the last move, Magnus. It was so counterintuitive retreating the bishop. He was trying to be too clever, Carlsen, but he didn't spot this last move, as Jovanka mentioned. And okay, pawn takes pawn. This is what we showed on the analysis board a moment ago. We do see that series of trades, and that's why Magnus Carlsen was thinking there a moment ago. He saw 3-4 moves ahead, and he went through that kind of simplification process, those exchanges. Now he's attacking Black's bishop, trying to kick it away. Once Black's bishop retreats, White's rook is going to activate itself along the open line. It's going to maybe jump up to the 7th rank. That's where rooks love to be.
Yeah, I was thinking the position is still not very pleasant for Anish. Okay, so he didn't move the bishop. In fact, he protected it with his rook. And Magnus, completely unfazed, he just slides his rook to the new open line that's now become available. And the plan is still very much in action. He wants to put his rook on the 7th line. And from there, he will put pressure on those pawns that are conveniently situated on light squares.
Yeah, so White has one, I mean, very deadly plan, actually, but Anish Giri does have a couple of moves to stop it. If we bring up the board, we can see this plan that Magnus is enacting now. It's going to be relevant for the next 10-20 moves, I think. Magnus now bringing his rook to the open line, but the rook is destined for a better square. If Black just plays too slowly, if, for example, he improves his king, then the White rook will jump up 7th heaven, the 7th rank, where all the pawns lie, and this is the target. Later on, White's bishop will try, it can't right now, but it'll want to try and gang up on this pawn. It's all about this pawn right now, and that's why Anish Giri finds a better move. He brings his rook back because this is White's target. This is the piece, this is the pawn that White wants to target with the rook and the bishop. So Black now stopping the White rook from invading and protecting it. Great defense by Anish Giri, and after White's rook jumped up, the Black bishop protects this pawn. Right now, Giri, he's in passive mode. He's kind of, he's just in lockdown mode, trying to defend everything. But, okay, so far he has been able to survive this long, and White still has a lot of work to do to try and win this game.
And we did see all the other games going on. One of them just finished. Fabiano Caruana getting revenge against Jan Nepomniachtchi after the candidates winning that game. Impressive stuff by Fabiano.
Yeah, I mean, he is a great player, and it's you know, he's classical world's number 2, but it's also really good to see him do well in these rapid formats, because traditionally Fabiano doesn't do well, and I've seen him really struggle. But okay,
and this was an important one, both on 2.5 points.
Yes.
So this 1 point that Fabiano is now getting will take him a long step towards knockout stage.
Yeah.
Nepomniachtchi in big trouble as well in terms of qualification, and okay, Magnus just improving the White bishop there. Note how both bishops, they're protecting pawns, but they're also protected by pawns. And that just gives some solidity, some stability to your position. That's often a good idea in these endgames. Now, neither side has to worry about those bishops. They'll be defended forever. And play is going to shift towards that right side of the board. Everything's going to happen on what we call the king side there. White's going to start pushing forward those pawns where he has a 4 versus 3 advantage. You have to push them correctly. You don't want to weaken yourself in the process. But at least there's a plan now for Magnus Carlsen, and Giri has to decide. Do you just sit still? Do you let that happen? Do you just wait and hope that your opponent pushes their pawns in the wrong or too hastily? Or do you try to maybe force the exchange of rooks somehow? I don't see how right now.
Yeah.
Jovanka, do you see a plan for Black?
Well, actually, it's to do with advancing the pawns. You mentioned it, you know, and this is something which I would be incredibly concerned about, is White would start advancing all their pawns on the right side, on the king side. And if Black were to allow White to just advance the pawns with a free run, then I think the position is going to be practically lost. So what I would be aiming to do is advance my own pawns in such a way that should White try to advance theirs, then that would involve exchanges.
Yeah.
Because the more pawns that get traded off, well, that favors the defender. So I would be thinking about picking up my pawn.
Corner pawn.
Yeah, that one.
Harry the H pawn.
Harry the H pawn, and I would be picking it up and moving it 2 squares. Okay, but Anish chooses instead to improve his king, and it's now in the 2nd row. But what's to stop Magnus from just advancing one of his pawns on the king side, on the right side?
There's nothing stopping him.
Which one would you pick up? Your knight pawn?
Yeah, I would pick up the pawn on the G line there in front of the White king. Push it forward 1 square. Gain a bit of space. Stop Black from advancing his own pawns. That tends to be a very traditional way. of advancing. There's an English grandmaster who we're both very familiar with, Keith Arkle, and that's his favourite move in chess. When to push those knight pawns forward. He's an endgame expert as well, so that's just a good way of clamping down on the opponent's pieces.
Yes.
So will we see Magnus just copy Anish Giri, maybe improve the white king, or will we see him start advancing those white pawns? I agree with you, Ivanka. I mean, forgetting all the bishops, forgetting all the pawns on the left side right now, forgetting that whole queen side, I think Black should have taken that opportunity to push his corner pawn forward, push Harry to the edge pawn, because you might not get that opportunity anymore. Okay, Magnus doesn't choose that one. He chooses to advance his king's pawn. That's normally a good move on move 1. Magnus normally plays that on move 1. This time he didn't, and he saved it for move 35. So pushing his king's pawn forward there. Okay, makes some sense as well. He's trying to push that as far as it can go. That actually is the only that's the only pawn that Black can never counter long term. That's where White's advantage lies with the king's pawn. So Black gives a check, and he has occupied the 7th rank now.
But this is something I was a little bit concerned about with the advance of that particular pawn, is that suddenly the consequence of that is that there's now a diagonal for the Black bishop to maybe start biting a little bit and looking at that weak pawn that is next to the king. And well, you can see there Anish has activated his rook. He's put it on the 2nd row. This is the perfect line for rooks to go on. And now there is a question, because there is the potential that Anish will start to activate his bishop and reroute it to a diagonal to attack the pawn next to the king.
Yeah, let's bring up the analysis board, because there's actually an immediate threat in the position. And as you mentioned, this is the pawn. This is the target now for Black. It's eyed up by the Black rook. But more importantly, if White is just complacent, if White just takes the time out to push some pawns, suddenly Black's bishop can come into the game. It looked offside there, but suddenly the bishop has got targets, is ganging up, teaming up with the Black rook, and White's pawns are starting to fall. But even if you stop this plan, even if, for example, you drop your king back, Ivanka's idea is not to use that square, but to relocate this bishop to another diagonal, to bring it back this way. And
but David, he don't care. Magnus has he's doing something else. So he's pushed his pawn in the center forward, and it looks like he might not care. That was my first initial impression, but there is a kind of idea, and the idea is that if if Black were to play the bishop move, then suddenly that pawn has now secured a square for the white rook, and Magnus can now defend the pawn.
Yeah. So Magnus had to defend this, but it does feel a bit rushed. There was no reason for Magnus to, I think, in this position, there was no reason to push this pawn forward. It's just given activity to the Black rook. You should have stopped the Black rook coming into the position, because now, currently, in the position we have on the board, suddenly at least Black has one active piece. And once this bishop gets active, I think this is actually a good move right now, attacking the rook and trying to line up on this diagonal. Once Black does this, at least both of Black's pieces are active. It's going to be so hard to break down, well, for White to defend his pawns while continuing to make progress. And in endgames, it's all about activity. You can't just sit slowly, you can't sit passively and let your opponent build up and do whatever they want. You have to create threats of your own, even in situations like this where you're a pawn down. And Giri, he does find this move. There's actually a trick in the position as well. If White plays rook takes pawn, then Black will not retreat his bishop, because White can slide across and defend this pawn. Instead, Black will sacrifice his rook. This is a common trick when your opponent's pieces are on the same color as your bishop. Black will sacrifice on this square, check. And after king takes rook, now we have a fork, a double attack. Black's bishop checks the king and will next move gobble up that white rook, restoring, winning back the rook and only one pawn down. And opposite colour bishops without rooks should be a draw. That's why Magnus Carlsen avoids that trick. He brings his rook across to defend this pawn. But he can't be happy, Magnus. The last few moves have not gone in his favour. Giri defending really, really resolutely.
And also with clocks ticking down here, what's your predictions, David? Will it end with a win for either of them?
5 moves ago, I would have said Magnus Carlsen win 90% sure. Now I think Anish Giri, he's quite likely to hold this game. I think he might save this one. Still, no risks for Carlsen. Giri is fighting for the draw. It's a 2-result game. Either White will win or it's a draw. Black will never win this one, but chances of a draw have increased a lot over the last few moves. Now Giri attacking the white rook and trying to set up that trick again. rook takes pawn. He's allowed this, Magnus Carlsen. He's played rook takes pawn. I thought this was something he didn't want to do, because now black's rook is going to take that pawn with check. What is Giri thinking about? This trick that I highlighted, giving up the black rook temporarily, is still in the position. He can still play it right now. What do you think, Ivanka? Black, no options, right? Black has to play rook takes pawn check.
Yeah, he absolutely has to do that.
Otherwise, he's just 2 pawns down.
Well, you know, traditionally, I'm very afraid now for Magnus's chances for the win, because traditionally, opposite colour bishop endgames are very, very drawish. And what do you think, David? Do you think it's possible to win it?
If black plays rook takes pawn, maybe Magnus won't take that rook. He'll try and keep the rooks on the board. But yeah, if the rooks disappear, and if black's able to regain 1 pawn, I think it's a dead draw. No chances with option.
Okay, well,
wow. Okay.
But you just said that he would move his king away, and you were wrong, David.
I was wrong. The rooks have disappeared. Now Magnus, he's still 1 pawn up. White has an extra corner pawn here, but opposite colour bishops, yeah, it's going to be hard to break down black's blockade of those dark squares. White trying to go active with his king. I expect to see black's king now try to relocate itself. Black's king was not doing anything, tucked away in the corner there, so the black king rushing over to the left side. Okay, it's a race. Can Magnus Carlsen promote his corner pawn? If he can't push it over the next few moves, it's going to be a dead draw. So can Anish Giri set up a blockade in the meantime?
Well, he's trying. I mean, the blockade will happen on the dark squares, and you can see Anish has mobilized his king. How is White going to even try to?
Yeah, there's a couple of problems in the position. If you rush with your king towards the left side, maybe black will say, okay, you go and spend 5-6 moves trying to promote your pawn. I'm going to go active with the black king. So you've got to time it correctly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because by active with the black king, there's also the possibility of that. Basically, the action for the black king will happen on the right side of the board, and it will try to gobble up and win as many pawns as possible. Because if the situation were to clarify itself and White would win the bishop, for instance, but doesn't have enough pawns on the board, then it will be a draw. And yeah, there you have a move by Magnus. Magnus is going to stop that. He's going to make the bid for the king or to the left side of the board, but when he's controlled the possible play on the right side, and that is why he's advanced his pawn 1 square forward.
That's the move you wanted to see 10 moves ago.
Yeah, exactly. Right? When the rooks were on the board, not now. Okay. So what would you play here now?
I think black can just wait with his bishop. Okay, he tries to initiate a trade of pawns, going for that strategy that you mentioned, Ivanka. Eliminating pawns only helps black. Because later on you can sacrifice the black bishop for white's remaining pawns just to eliminate everything and make the draw. King and bishop against the king is a draw. Yeah. So, yep, great move there, I think, from Anish Giri, just trying to ease the pressure immediately. There was maybe no rush for that, but why not go for it right now? Magnus, he pretty much has to trade a set of pawns. He has to allow a set of trades, because if you pushed your pawn up 1 square, it would have been on a dark square, it would have been easy pickings for the black bishop. So now Anish Giri, he'll just trade off that pawn. Yep, you want to eliminate all of your opponent's potential queens.
Yeah, I wouldn't even think about it. I would just trade off the pawn. And then the question is, should I trade off? Should I try to trade off more?
I think it's just an easy draw. I don't think black needs to do anything. If we bring up the analysis board, and if we can keep an eye on the players, because I think Giri's about to make a couple of quick moves, but what black should do, just trade a set of pawns here, eliminate as many pawns as possible, then just drop the bishop back. Keep the bishop on this square. Okay, he doesn't do that, but if you keep the bishop on this square, you keep white's king honest. You keep white's king having to defend this pawn, and you stop the advance of white's pawn here, so nothing to do. White cannot do anything. There's no progress to be made. Instead, Anish Giri blocks the pawn from this angle, and maybe he'll plant the bishop on this square instead, from where it keeps an eye on this pawn. Yeah, I think Magnus, he's lost the thread here. He needed to keep rooks on the board. Without rooks, opposite colour bishops, it's just too drawish. No real chances. Just pawns are disappearing.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. I don't think there's any chances. And while we're waiting for Anish to respond to that, he has moved his bishop, and just note how the bishop is just staying fixed on that diagonal, and it's keeping an eye on that corner pawn on the left. And now Magnus is just simply moving the bishop around. I just think there's no way to make progress at all.
Yeah, no winning plan for
No.
white. As soon as you run with the white king over to that left side of the board, the black king will get active, and the white pawn in the middle of the board will drop off.
And there's just also no way to prevent the pawn on the right just disappearing.
Being traded.
So yeah, exactly. So I just do think the position will fizzle out into a draw. But I do have to show you before we see another move. Oh, okay. And it's a really cool picture as well. So
Nothing's changing though. The bishops are just maneuvering, dancing around.
Well, I do have a cool picture from Joe Gathercole. He says, me and the class love to watch the streams nearing the end hours of the day. And there is a picture with Joe and the class waving to us. Yes, so while we're waiting for the picture, there it is.
Oh.
There it is.
So cool.
I know.
High class.
Definitely. And their school uniforms are cool.
Yeah.
And,
Hi to all of you. Fantastic that you're following.
Okay, meanwhile, just nothing had changed much until this last move by Magnus. Magnus offering a trade of pawns, but once this set of pawns disappear, yeah, we're heading towards that draw. Magnus now will play bishop takes pawn, but all black needs to do is plant his remaining pawn on a dark square. Black's pawn, push it. Okay, first he brings the black king over to that left side. Actually, they just agree a draw. There was just no way through to break black's blockade. White's extra pawn didn't count for anything, and Anish Giri saves the game.
Magnus still sitting there. Is he disappointed?
Yes, I think on a better day, if Magnus is in top form, he would have